This is episode number 2 of Bruno's podcast, coming to you from a car. As I said in the first episode, my studio is going to be changing a little bit as things progress. I'm hoping that for the next episodes to be able to have a decent setup in the Canary Islands, where I'm going back for a few weeks. I hope that all the migrants and the military-aged men won't get to me. But we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. I think migration is something interesting and something that we should be talking about. Right now, in fact, which is somehow related, we will get to it, but UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has been called to resign. This follows a series of strategic mistakes and poor decisions that he's had over the past year and change. The latest one being him appointing the UK's ambassador to the US, knowing that he had connections to Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson, I believe is his name, Peter Mandelson. Now, this guy, I believe, is now being called to resign. Or has resigned already, obviously. Who knows if there will be some sort of legit investigation into what is it that he do with Epstein, why was he in contact with Epstein, especially when it is obvious now that a lot of people that were in contact with Jeffrey Epstein knew of his, I believe it was a 2007 or 2008 conviction as a pedophile. He was convicted by a court. So a lot of this is being now obviously, is in the news. A lot of these high-profile individuals. For those of you that might have seen the Norwegian royal family, and a bunch of Norwegian politicians are having a very hard time. Many of them having very close contact with Jeffrey Epstein. And again, a lot of these people are now sort of resigning, moving into the shadows, unclear what's going to happen to them. Will there be proper investigations that look into potential crimes in relation to their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? TBD, I guess, But it's obviously that a lot of these politicians are compromised. And Keir Starmer is no exception. He has also been criticized very heavily for his stance on Palestine, or rather the lack of action or speed in terms of some of the decisions that the UK government has made. This in total opposition to countries like Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, I believe also Norway, that moved very quickly to recognize Palestine, to speak up against the actions of Israel, and so on. And it's interesting to look at the case of the UK. Once a great country, English breakfast, rugby, football, whatever, strong economy, finance, one of the finance capitals of the world, still obviously very relevant, but is slowly losing a lot of its prestige. A lot of its millionaires, its billionaires are flying out to Dubai. We'll get back to that in a second, but a lot of the people are leaving, wealthy people, because obviously you are paying very high taxes, very high income taxes compared to other places, for example, the UAE. And the country's not doing well, precisely. There is a lot of shoplifting, petty crime. I believe in 2025, there were reported over 530,000 cases of shoplifting. And I will link the sources to the description below so that you guys can see it. But to put that into context, which is over 1,400 shoplifting incidents a day. And I think this was only England and Wales. So the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, this is only including Wales and England. This is only covering those two places. Anyway, over 1,400 shoplifting incidents a day. To put that into reference, France reported over the same period 70,000. So that's almost 8 times more than what France has seen. And, France is relatively famous for the pickpockets, the shoplifting. I think, funny enough, in France, 25% of the shoplifting was done by employees. And that's because people have no money. People are having a very fucking hard time with the cost of living. And that is something that now Keir Starmer is using to stay in power. He's saying that he's not going to resign, that he was elected to address affordability, and that he would never step down from a position of power where he has been elected to. And in all fairness, it is true. I mean, Labour won in a landslide in the UK. They won big. And that was also because of the previous, Rishi Sunak, out of touch, extremely wealthy guy, millionaire family, trying to relate to the common folk, the regular working Joe didn't work out. He was broadly disliked, maybe rightly so. But I think it is important to appreciate that a lot of the deterioration that we've seen in the UK, I mean, I guess we can attribute it to many things, but Brexit, it's an obvious one. And the way Brexit has affected the UK, first of all, not from 2020, which is when, now it's been 6 years, which is exactly when the UK officially left the EU. But even since the vote back in 2016, it's now been 10 years, a decade since we voted on Brexit. Well, the UK voted on Brexit, winning by a simple majority. Many people have criticized that and have said that a super majority would have been needed. So over 65% of the vote would have been needed to do such a huge move, which is to leave the second largest economy in the world, the EU, and the largest single market. Obviously a dumb decision now. In hindsight, I guess, you probably had to be some kind of Einstein to be able to understand that that was a bad decision. To get out of a huge single market with over 150 million people, a market that was able to supply a lot of your labor with low-skilled, mid-skilled workers coming from Eastern Europe primarily, Poland. It's a big case, but also the Baltics and other Eastern European countries where a lot of their people were traveling to the UK, to Ireland as well, for English-speaking countries. So a bit easier for anyone that is unable to maybe speak German or French or any other language that might be spoken in other wealthier countries compared to the Eastern European ones. But still, that supply of labor started declining very, very fast. Not in 2020, when the UK left the EU officially, but already from the year they voted. If you look at the statistics, you can see a huge drop in EU migration from 2016, which was partially countered by a non-EU migration into the UK. But anyway, obviously, it's been a decade of turmoil for the UK. In 10 years, they've had 5 prime ministers, perhaps 6 if you count also not James Cameron, the movie director, but David Cameron, who resigned after the Brexit vote because it's something that he didn't agree on. So that would be 6 prime ministers in the span of 10 years alone. And again, Keir Starmer is running on this affordability angle, which is something that every politician is doing right now. Everyone is doing the same thing because it's a huge issue. It's very tough to solve, and it can be attributed to a number of things that might feel the current administration that is denouncing that as one of your biggest problems as the citizen has limited control over. That is a huge task that needs to solve. So they're also using this as a way to reinforce their mandate, to be able to stay in power and claim that they are trying to work to solve it. But housing, which is a huge problem right now in many Western countries, I think we talked about Canada last time, but also like obviously in the EU, in Europe, the only thing that you can do is two things. Either you build more houses or you address somehow the uninhabited number of apartments that you have, which again, many of them are investments, from wealthy people that are just sitting on these apartments, on these properties, like they are an asset. And they're not renting them, they're not selling them, they're just sitting on them. So again, you're not able to build a lot of these houses because you don't have the labor. You used to have the labor in the case of the UK because you were able to get mid-skilled, low-skilled workers from Eastern European countries to come in and build those houses. Now you don't have that anymore. And it's interesting how here the dynamic of migration plays. So again, it's important that we separate legal migration, which would be economic migrants, people that migrate for work-related reasons, students, refugees are also legal migrants, and then illegal migration, which are people that arrive by boat, they cross your border illegally, etc. So those would be illegal migrants that are unregistered, let's say unaccounted for within the system. And it's interesting, for example, to see that in Norway and Sweden, with refugees / illegal migrants as well, to some extent, they've had hugely different experiences. And I'm just saying this in terms of like how things are managed. So Sweden has had what we can say we can call a very bad experience with migration. There's no question about it. They've had to reduce the age for gang-related offenses from, I believe it's like 13 to 12 or 14 to 13. Malmo, which is one of the largest cities in the south of the country, is in a lot of gang violence and other problems. Then you also have neighbor just next to Sweden, Norway, which has had a completely different experience with the refugees. And this is because of how they've managed it. So in Sweden, where a lot of these refugees would get handouts, clothing, housing, a number of benefits, and that would be it. They would just, stay in the country without having really to do anything else. In Norway, to be able to get the same benefits and retain them, being able to keep getting them, you also had to follow certain courses. And this is, or I don't know if it still is, but at least it was for a certain period mandatory. So people would have to attend courses on Norwegian culture, the role of women in Norway, and Norwegian language to be able to facilitate that integration. And this is crucial to understand because a lot of the refugees and some of the illegal migrants as well are coming to Europe and they are pissed off. And I think it's sort of understandable because, again, Western countries have actively supported wars of destabilization in those countries. They have, taken down leaders, so-called dictators, and they have completely destroyed some of these countries, forcing the people to basically leave, and the closest place where they could go, where there is also high level of high standard of living and good conditions overall, it's Europe, so they end up coming here. Now, I will say that I have personally a very hard time, again, calling out refugees' behavior, or whether even if it's bad. I'm not saying criminal, but bad, unpolite, or whatever, because they have effectively been forced to leave their country because of the actions of our governments. Now, I will say that in the case of Sweden and other places like Ireland and Austria that are not part of NATO, or well, now Sweden is part of NATO since the right after the war in Ukraine started. Sweden and Finland have also joined NATO, but before they weren't part of NATO, just like Ireland is not part of NATO, Austria is not part of NATO. So these countries bear less responsibility, in my opinion, in my view, compared to other European countries, at least relatively to those countries like France, Germany, Italy, where in Italy you had NATO troops refueling their planes to go bomb Libya. Libya now is again a country that has been completely destroyed. There are actual slave markets in Libya. Today, in the 21st century, 2026, there are slave markets in Libya, and now Giorgia Meloni, the president of Italy, is saying that they have passed a law that is gonna enable them to block vessels from coming to Italy. So when they see them approaching, they will basically stop them and not allow them to enter Italian waters, because once they enter Italian waters, then they sort of become responsibility of Italy and they need to take care of them. As I said in the previous episode, a lot of other European countries will not want to take those migrants, and so the cycle continues, so to speak. I'm gonna try to get the light back on here. There you go. So that's sort of the first thing on that angle. The second thing that I wanted to say is that migration and this, like military-aged men and this invasion that we're having in Europe, a lot of it is sort of fabricated. This is something that politicians use constantly to, again, legitimize their mandate, being able to scare people and turn people against each other. To some extent, the famous divide and conquer, it's one of the hottest talking points that politicians like to use is migration. And so when we talk about replacement, differences in culture, and how that might lead to like a clash in the country, again, looking at the example of Norway and how they dealt with people coming from other countries compared to Sweden, you see two totally different stories. One is one of success and one is one of now chaos, gang violence, etc. And it's interesting to me how, if you look at the Gulf countries, the GCC, particularly very wealthy countries like the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, where a lot of UK millionaires and billionaires are moving to, countries like Qatar, countries like Saudi Arabia, if you look at their population, they have a huge male surplus. In fact, if you were to look at a population pyramid that shows women and men on one side, on the male side, you see huge bulges of that surplus of how many more men there are. In fact, for example, I believe it is in Qatar, that has a population of 3 million people, there are 2.1 million men. There are a lot of men in the country, and I believe the surplus is 1 point something. It's like around half the population of Qatar. And that is because the actual population of Qataris are 500,000, around 500,000, even though the country has 3 million people. So have they been replaced? Isn't that what we're saying in Europe, that we're going to be overtaken by other countries? The same is true for the UAE, for the United Arab Emirates. The same is true for other smaller countries in the region. It's not true for Saudi, because Saudi has a much larger population, over 30 million people. And so you're not going to get 30 million migrants, obviously. But in the case of the UAE, where you have a population of, I think it's between 10 and 12 million, if I'm not mistaken, actual Emiratis are 1.3. Native populations in some of the GCC countries, the Gulf, Qatar, UAE, the native populations are the minority in that country. And if you look at who's coming to those countries, they are military-aged men. Oh my God. All these military-aged men that are an invading army that are coming. And where do they come from? You can see that they come, a lot of them, from Pakistan. They come from India. They come from Afghanistan. They come from Southeast Asia, and they come to work. And if you go to these countries, they are some of the safest countries in the world. They're extremely safe, extremely clean as well, for the most part. Infrastructure impeccable. And that is because migration, if you look at it from a pure economics perspective, forget what the hell, why there is more Chinese restaurants here, why there are so many halal shops around my neighborhood now. Forget all of that. If you look at the migration as an economic phenomena, all of these people that are coming to your country and that will pay taxes, will spend money, are people where your government, the receiving government, hasn't really made an investment in terms of paying for their education, from kindergarten or preschool, primary school, all the way to sometimes university. So the idea, obviously, in Western countries is that, we give all of these benefits to our citizens, and that will also sort of incentivize them at some point, to stay in the country, pay taxes, and, sort of the loop continues, so to speak, right? And again, you have all of these countries where there is a huge number of immigrants, more than the native population. So I guess they've been replaced. Oh my God, we've been replaced by Asians, which is also, some of these groups, the reason why I mentioned that most of them come from Pakistan, from India, is because those are also many of the migrants that have been going to the UK, also for colonial reasons. So again, there might be a moral issue there, where you were colonizing these countries, and obviously with all the horrible stuff that comes with colonization, we are seeing it now in Palestine and how Israel is behaving. But so it's also a little bit delicate to say that you don't want to get people from the country that you were colonizing. I think it's not straightforward for people to be able to say that. And so now we look at the UK, where, as I mentioned, there are huge cases of shoplifting going through the roof, over 1,400 on average in 2025. Are you fucking kidding me? I mean, what is that? Also, we see news about the stabbings and whatnot, etc. Many problems. And a lot of it, I think, it has to do with, plain and simple, the laws that we have in place to protect citizens, to ensure that there is rule and order. For example, in the UK, if you steal anything below £200, you might get even only a verbal warning. Hey, be careful next time, don't do it again. And all across Europe, in many countries, we have these thresholds where if something is the value of whatever you might be stealing or destroying, if you're destroying property, is below a certain amount, €200, 400, 1,000, etc. There are different thresholds. The penalties vary, and oftentimes the penalties are super low. Again, in the case of the UK, for anything less than £200, you might get only a verbal warning, perhaps a fine, whatever. And so it's interesting to me how, for instance, if you look at the UAE, none of that would be allowed. None of that it's allowed today. You might go to jail, you might have to pay a fine, you might even get deported if you're not an Emirati. So there are very serious consequences for that kind of behavior. And so people are not behaving like that. And so the question seems to be obvious, that should be, why are we not changing some of these laws to deter people from engaging in behavior that is unsafe, dangerous, criminal, whatever? And I think it really has to do with how politicians love to play the migration card as well, to get into office, to get into power. I mean, what else would be the reason? It seems super straightforward to be able to rectify laws. The same way in Sweden, they were able to lower the age of gang-related violence. of for members to be considered guilty from 13 to 12. That was done. Why we cannot change also the repercussions of behavior that is criminal? Again, how come that countries that are receiving millions of migrants, outnumbering the local population, are able to be some of the cleanest, safest, wealthiest countries in the world, and for us in Europe, we seem to be unable to manage migration in the same way? It's very strange and very sad, in my opinion, and I think many people will agree with this. I think, again, what the UK and many other European countries doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems to me that it's something that could be easily fixed, and I don't know why we're not fixing it. I don't know really where we go from here. I'm gonna try to change also the subject of next episodes. I want to talk about other stuff that hasn't just to do with migration and housing, even though those are like very hot topics. But I think they're important to talk about, and I think at the very least we should be able to have a little laugh and talk about these things with freedom, and not being coerced or fear consequences and being trumped from being able to just speak up and say things as we see them. Again, I think migration is obviously a positive thing. Many countries in Europe have benefited greatly from migration, and it seems to me that many of the things that we should be doing to rectify the way things are managed now are pretty easy and straightforward. And it's unclear to me why we're dragging our feet. Why politicians, which I think it might have to do with the fact that we have some of the most incompetent leadership in European countries that we've seen for a very long time. Case in point can also be the situation in Ukraine, a European country that is being destroyed in front of our eyes. And I'm going to be talking about that in the next episode, marking the 4-year anniversary of the war, the unprovoked war. More on that next week. Don't you worry, we're going to be talking about that as well, because it's super interesting. And again, it doesn't make any sense. Europe is not better off. We are making very bad decisions on many fronts. And again, now the UK, which is dealing with a lot of the negative externalities and the negative outcomes of their policies, their finance minister, Miss Reeves, Her Excellency Miss Reeves, has said that closer cooperation and integration with the EU is key for the UK to see economic growth and prosperity, etc. What? Do you really need to be a minister to realize that being part of the second largest economy in the world, when you take into account the EU as a whole, and the single largest market was a net positive? That is obvious, and a lot of people were obviously sold on the idea of Brexit based on lies, pure lies from Farage, Boris Johnson, and others, fishermen, namely. You can look this up. This is really interesting how fishermen were some of the demographics. Obviously, fishermen, they live in remote rural locations, but many people have fishermen in their family, and so they would also sort of side with them on this issue. And one of the reasons also why the UK has been doing so bad is because they weren't able to strike a very good exit deal with the EU. They didn't control their waters as they were hoping for, and a lot of the fishermen in the UK are suffering immensely from this. And now, not all of them, if you look interviews online, they would tell you that was a bad idea, that they were basically sold lies, that politicians went there to say something to their face, and then they never had an intention to obviously go to go to war or die on the hill of water sovereignty with the EU to be able to retain at least some of the benefits of being near the EU. And this is interesting because obviously the UK has always had a very particular stance when it comes to its relations to the EU. You know, they obviously always wanted to retain the pound, their currency, which for other countries that join the EU, that are part of the EU, you're supposed to adopt the euro at some point. This is supposed to strengthen the currency, etc., etc. The UK obviously was never going to do that. They were also one of the two countries, together with Ireland, that chose to stay outside of Schengen. So Schengen, for those that don't know, it's effectively the area of the EU where you have the four freedoms, which are freedom of movement, freedom of capital, freedom of services, and freedom of labor. So they deliberately chose to stay out of that to retain some more control over their border. Other countries were actually imposed this to be outside of Schengen, at least at the beginning. For instance, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria. All of them now are starting to join Schengen slowly because they are meeting certain criteria. There is other stuff playing around also in terms of like how they are, in the case of Romania, how they have dealt with Russia in the aftermath of Ukraine. We will get to all of that in the next episode, but a lot of it has been, do you adopt the euro? So all of these countries did not have the euro, and now they have been forced to adopt the euro, and as a reward, we'll let you into Schengen to make it easier for you, again, to be more integrated with the EU. Cyprus is also not part of Schengen. Again, a lot of these, for these four countries that I just mentioned, Croatia, Cyprus, Bulgaria, and Romania, it also has to do with the fact that they have issues with their borders. Obviously, Cyprus is splitted into two. There is the Turkish side and there is the Cypriot side. But in the case of Romania, for example, you also have Moldova, which is de facto Romania, if I can put it just plain like that. And so the fact that a lot of people from Moldova are able to just buy Romanian passports, and there are some issues with sort of, you know, like how institutions work in those countries, effectively resulted in the EU imposing to those countries, yes, you're joining the EU, but you're not yet joining Schengen. Anyway, this is just to make the point that the UK deliberately chose to be in that group, and in part to retain a bit more autonomy. So they've always had, I wouldn't say a full foot outside of the EU, but they've always wanted to do things a little bit their own way. This has obviously backfired incredibly. A lot of companies also have been, you know, especially finance companies have been relocated to Paris, to Dublin, to Germany, different cities in Germany, because they are not as wealth and finance is not as concentrated as it is in Paris for France or in Dublin for Ireland. But anyway, just to say that the UK obviously has been not doing very well. Now their finance minister, with all her degrees, is saying that perhaps we should have closer ties to the EU. No shit. Yes, you should, obviously. The UK was, you know, one of the strongest countries in the EU. It still is one of the largest economies today, part of the G7, etc. But it's losing a lot of its prestige, and it's very sad how it's happening and how fast it's happening. Anyway, I'm gonna close there off today. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and I'll see you next week, where I will be hoping to have a proper studio or something resembling a proper studio that I'm gonna set up with a friend of mine. And yeah, till then, see you.